This is All Out Politics, news, debate and opinion from the heart of Westminster. And Mrs May will hold talks with the German Chancellor Angela Merkel later today amid growing impatience, we're told, amongst the EU leaders at the UK's apparent reluctance to spell out its goals in the Brexit negotiations. The two leaders are meeting in Berlin ahead of a speech by the Prime Minister in Munich tomorrow, in which she'll outline Britain's future security relations with the European Union. Meanwhile, the Chancellor of Exchequer, Philip Hammond, is also touring European capitals, trying to build business and political ties. But are these visits making any difference? Here with me to discuss this are Nina Trentman, she's the news editor for the Wall Street Journal in London, Dr Eunice Goish, Associate Professor of Politics at Richmond American International University and a former London correspondent for a Portuguese newspaper, and the French-Algerian journalist Nabila Ramdani. Well, let's start with Germany. Mrs Merkel unusually reported to rather be mocking Theresa May. So is there quite a lot of ground for her to make up today?
Well, I guess that was one of the stories that came out a couple of weeks ago that made a lot of headlines in the UK, and I guess the reaction in the UK that we saw then in Germany was a bit like, oh, really? Did this happen? Independent of whether it did happen or not, I guess it's quite important today for Merkel to, in the end, signal that there's a will to discuss and a will to communicate with the UK, even though I guess there's, as it's obvious that there's many differences that remain between the two countries, not just the Germans, but also then the European Union and the UK with regards to the conditions of this transition period between Britain's exit and a future trade agreement.
I mean, it's a bit of a conflict because on the one hand, expressions of impatience allegedly. On the other hand, some British sources are sort of clinging at the idea that somehow the nation states, led by Germany of the European Union, are rather more open to doing deals than Michel Barnier and Brussels.
Well, I guess it remains to be seen how much of that is actually coming through or not. We are seeing different opinions in different capitals, but in the end, very close to this position that the EU has laid out. So it's not as if we are seeing an orchestra of different opinions here, offering all sorts of different things to the UK, even though, of course, there might be slight differences between the European capitals in what kind of details they would like to see for that future trade deal between the UK and the EU. I would say it would be a bit too far to say, okay, there's different national interests between Germany and, say, France or Italy or other European governments.
I mean, President Macron, for example, has talked about closer future relationships with the UK outside the EU.
Yes, and that's one of the reasons why he made a big deal out of his recent visit during the UK, the Franco-British summit, when he came over. But I would largely agree with Nina saying that Macron's attitude overall is, like most of EU leaders, is pretty much the same. I think, including the big hitters, and especially Angela Merkel, his view is that Britain is leaving a highly influential and indeed privileged position within the EU. It retains its own currency. It's not part of the Schengen area. Historically, Margaret Thatcher had achieved a massive rebate from Europe, and yet it wants to spend years and even decades trying to redefine its position within the EU from a considerably less position of.
But even if it's a mistake, there's a slight sense that France is holding the door open because Britain's been an obstacle to France's vision of the European Union for many years.
Well, I think Macron made it clear during a press conference at the Élysée Palace early this week that he didn't want to waste any time on Brexit, as he put it, and he'd prefer to leave everything to Michel Barnier, the EU Commissioner. And it has to be said that he also has his own plans for reforms.
To be French, of course.
Yes, exactly. But Macron also has his own plans for reforms in the EU. He, for example, wants the European Parliament to be more representative of real people, just like his own En Marche political party. And he's sick of party political posturing. He wants the European project to be more practical and more problem-solving, and indeed change people's lives for the better and be less oriented towards particular interest groups.
Dr. Gerst, is anyone going to miss the British?
Well, the Portuguese will for sure make lots of very nice noises about missing their oldest ally, but most member states, they are committed to this vision of European integration. Most of the countries that are part of the Eurozone, they want to deepen that integration, and they will also want to prioritize the reform of the monetary union, which is quite necessary. There are bigger problems than Brexit. Everybody is very sad to see Britain leave the European Union, but people are kind of getting used to the idea, and I think that people are also getting tired a bit because it's been years that we've been discussing Britain's relationship with the European Union, renegotiating, etc., etc.
Sure. I mean, there's some people who supported Remain here who are saying, well, actually, this could all unravel, and between now and next March, we could decide this is all a ghastly mistake and we'd like to stay on our present terms. How do you think that would go down?
I think that would be possible, and I think the European Union would, it would be a sigh of relief across the European capitals, because it's terrible, it's a huge chunk of the EU budget that will disappear. Britain contributes to European defence. It is a big country. So I think they would be very happy to untrigger Article 50.
Do you think so?
Yeah, I'm not sure about the procedural arrangements, but I think from a political point of view...
According to the guy who wrote it, who happens to be British, he says you could just say, sorry, we want to withdraw our letter.
I think from a political point of view, that would, of course, from a German perspective, be a very desirable option, just because, not only because of, it would also free up time to discuss other things that are pressing in the European Union, but also from an economic point of view, Germany has big interests here in the UK, and so, of course, it would be very welcome.
Do you think France would welcome Britain back if it withdrew Article 50?
Well, Macron said so. He said he leave the door open at any opportunity. But, of course, Macron is always very polite and diplomatic. But deep down, you detect blood-mindedness and, indeed, real anger about Brexit. He very passionately feels that Britain has thrown the chessboard in the air rather than playing the game like everybody else.
So would he therefore want to punish Britain?
No, I don't think so. I think he's far more pragmatic than that. I think there's a state of confusion in France. The French people feel that, they're even more baffled, dare I say, than the British about what Brexit will eventually entail. I think the French are well known for holding referendums about treaties and, whether people are happy about them or not. But the sense of real shock comes when there's this single referendum about such incredibly high stakes, and effectively millions of Britons voted to abandon Europe completely. It was literally an in-out referendum.
Oh, well, let's look at it the other way. The clock is ticking. We keep on being told this. How much pressure is there on the European side, because of the importance of the UK economically, if it's going to be outside, to actually reach a deal that's acceptable to both sides by March?
I think the position of the European Union is, show us what are your cards, what is it that you want, and let's see what we can agree.
Yeah, I understand that.
So far, Britain hasn't done that. And the idea that the EU is going to make the important concessions that Britain wants, I don't think that is going to happen, because ultimately what is at stake is the integrity of the European Union. And if that is it will be endangered by the deal that the Foreign Secretary wants, and other members of the cabinet want, that is not going to happen.
But Brexiteers are saying, well, so what, no deal? If it has to be no deal, that would be something that we would survive and something that Europe would lose more out. What do you say to that?
I guess it's difficult to say at this point in time, because it's still very unclear under which conditions
But how much anxiety is there in Germany that the Brits might sort of double up on what they've done already and just crash out, and for the economic and other
Well, from a
consequences
domestic German perspective, it's then let them do that. The thing is,
there's not anxiety about it.
No, there is, of course, people don't want this to happen, because it's a very, that's not how you want a long and oftentimes successful relationship to end. But it's not as if there's huge concerns amongst German companies or amongst Germans to say...
It's been put many times in this studio, look, the car industry is integrated, the Germans sell a lot of Mercedes and BMWs to us, we are part of their production line. If we crash out, that's going to be disrupted, therefore it's in their interest to give us a good deal.
Also, don't forget, German car companies now make most of their revenues either in the US or in China. So the UK is an important market, and of course it will for 2-3 years then be disruptive to supply chains, and it won't be nice. But it's not something where people are now sitting there and they're scared.
As you look at it, what do you think the chances are of no deal?
I hope that there's going to be some sort of agreement between the two.
Well, I think what we can safely state is that whatever your views on Brexit, none of this process is pointing towards stability, and certainly not any certainty, and not in the short term. And I think that, the best that Britain and Europe can hope for after March 2019 is that there will be a period of stalemate where Britain will effectively be in and out of the EU.
We haven't even got agreement on that one either. What do you think? A deal in the end?
There will be one, but I think it's pointing more in the direction of a really hard Brexit.
OK, thank you all very much indeed. This is All Out Politics. Coming up next, Out and Proud, the Brexiteer artists coming out of the closet to make the case for leaving the EU.